Well, thank you. It is a great pleasure to be in your beautiful city here. And first I'd like to say thank you all for going to the trouble of learning English, making my life so much easier. You've done all the hard work. All I've got to do is talk in my own language. Well, my theme this evening is science and spiritual practices. We're in a completely new situation today, which is extremely interesting both from the scientific and the spiritual point of view. Although there's been a large-scale decline in traditional religion in Europe, there's been a great increase in recent years in interest in spirituality. And at the same time, we have access to spiritual traditions from all over the world. When I was a boy at school, I'd never heard of yoga or meditation. And today, millions of people are doing them all over Europe, even in small towns and villages. Practices that have spread very far from their native land in India. And you can now do Qigong and Chinese practices, and you can do Tai Chi. You can go on shamanic psychedelic tourist journeys to Peru and take ayahuasca. You can do Native American shamanic drumming. There's so many things you can do now that most people had never heard of a couple of generations ago here in Europe. And at the same time, there's been a tremendous increase in recent years in scientific studies of these practices. People used to think that science and spirituality were completely separate or opposite or even in opposition. But there have now been many scientific studies of the effects of religious and spiritual practices. And they were brought together recently in a handbook called the Handbook of Religion and Health, which is about that thick, and it costs about £200. I mean, it brings together the results from more than 2,000 scientific papers published in scientific journals. And what these studies show, on average, is that for most people, spiritual and religious practices make them happier, healthier, and live longer. And the effects are really pronounced. The extension of life can be up to 10 years or more. So there's an enormous effect of these practices which is scientifically measurable. Presumably the opposite is also true. Not doing these practices makes you unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter. These findings have not been lost on a new generation of atheists, because old-style atheists, practicing atheists, don't do any of these things, and therefore run the risk of being unhappier and unhealthier. But a new generation of atheists have accepted this message, these findings, and are now taking up spiritual practices themselves. Sam Harris, for example, one of the so-called new atheists in the United States, who wrote a book called The End of Faith, is now giving online meditation courses. The British popular philosopher Alain de Botton, who was raised atheist, in his book, his recent book, he tells us that his parents, who were Jewish and lived in Zurich, were militant atheists. If anyone visited their house and showed the slightest interest in religion, his parents treated them as if they were suffering from a terminal degenerative disease and never took them seriously thereafter. And he was raised like that, and he said he's never challenged the beliefs he was raised with, but he does wonder what happens, what you do next. What is, as he puts it, atheism 2.0? And he's written a book to explain what he thinks it is. The book is called Religion for Atheists. He thinks that atheists may miss out because they no longer have the chance to go and sing together with members of their community, to visit sacred places, to celebrate festivals, to go on pilgrimages, to hear sermons which are about how to lead a better life rather than just about facts. So he's trying to do something about this. He's planning to build an atheist temple in London. He's a very rich man, so he can easily make that happen. But rather easier to organize, he's already started a series of atheist sermons on Sunday mornings in London. And meanwhile, in England, we now have an atheist church called the Sunday Assembly, with about 70 different branches. And the members of this gather together on Sunday mornings to sing songs together and to tell uplifting stories. And they started by calling it an atheist church. They've now changed the name. They prefer it to be called mystical humanism. So these are movements that are going on because the spiritual practices are actually really helpful in people's lives, make them feel happier, healthier, more connected. And they have all sorts of effects on people's well-being, which I shall deal with in more detail in a moment. Well, this is the context in which I've written this book, Science and Spiritual Practices. And in it I discuss 7 different spiritual practices. This is not the only 7. There are plenty of spiritual practices. In fact, I've just completed a second book with 7 more. But there are even more after that. I'm not going to write any more on the subject, but 14's enough. But there are many different kinds of spiritual practice. And the reason I've chosen these particular 7 is because they show a wide range of kinds of practice. And they're also ones I do myself, because I've been a scientist my entire working career. I still spend most of my time in research. But I also do these spiritual practices and have always been interested in them, or at least for many years. So the 7 practices I discuss in my book are: first, meditation; secondly, gratitude; thirdly, connecting with nature; fourthly, relating to plants, particularly trees and flowers. In a sense, that's an extension of connecting with nature. Fifthly, singing and chanting. This is something I've learned a lot about from my wife, Jill Peirce, who pioneered in England the revival of group chanting and teaches the fundamental principles of chanting. And it was through her experience in these workshops that I realized that many people can take part in spiritual practices, whatever their religious beliefs, whether they have religious beliefs or not. Seeing how effective Jill's workshops are with people, whatever their belief, is really what convinced me that this approach of spiritual practices is a really important one. So anyway, there's a whole chapter about singing and chanting, which are part of every traditional culture and religion. And then rituals. Again, rituals are found in every religion and in many secular contexts as well. And finally, pilgrimage. So these are the 7 practices I discuss in my book, and all of them have been investigated scientifically to varying degrees. I don't have time this evening to speak about all of them, but I'm going to start with gratitude, because in a sense this is the most fundamental and simplest of all spiritual practices. All religions encourage gratitude. All of them have prayers and songs and hymns of thanksgiving. All of them recognize this fundamental principle. The starting point for modern discussions of gratitude, though, comes from a branch of psychology. Around the year 2000, a new school of psychology began, starting in the United States, called positive psychology. And positive psychology differs from the older style of psychology, which was mostly about what makes people miserable. Positive psychology is about what makes people happy. So the positive psychologists wanted to find out what enables people to be happier and have a greater sense of well-being. They started off by getting volunteers to wear pagers, which would go off at random times during the day. And when they got a signal, they had to write down what they were doing and how happy they felt on a 1 to 9 scale. 9 meant very happy, 1 meant very unhappy. And it turned out that people were happy when they were doing all sorts of different things. People were sometimes very happy when they were engaged in their work, when they were dancing, when they were singing, when they were playing sports, when they were having a very good conversation. The common factor of all these kinds of activities that made people happy was that they felt in the state of flow. They felt connected to something bigger than themselves, in a state of flow. And one of the things they found in these studies on happiness is that they then started looking at people who are unusually happy to find out what are their characteristics. And they found that people who are unusually happy are usually people who are very grateful, and that happy people are grateful. And when they first discovered this, it was a very strong correlation between gratitude and happiness. And not only happiness, but also being popular and being other people enjoying the company of these people. The critics, when they first discovered this, said, well, of course these people are grateful. They're grateful because they're happy. So they wanted to find out whether they were grateful because they were happy or happy because they were grateful. So they did experiments, being scientists. The first experiment involved dividing a group of volunteers into three at random. One group were asked to write down a list of things that made them miserable during the previous week, things that annoyed them. The second group wrote a story about things from the previous week. And the third group wrote a list of things for which they felt particularly grateful. And it turned out the people who wrote the list of things for which they were grateful were measurably happier for days afterwards. It had a really striking effect, even though it was quite a brief exercise. They found that the most effective of all their experiments involved what they called the gratitude letter. They asked people to write a letter of thanks to someone who'd helped them in their life who they'd never properly thanked. It could be a teacher, a family member, a friend. So they wrote the letter thanking them, acknowledging what they'd done for them, and then they went to that person and read them the letter. And when they did that, people were happier for up to 2 months afterwards, just from doing this simple thing. Partly as a result of these discoveries, there are now a whole host of self-help books on how to be more grateful have sprung up in America. And of course, since it's a highly commercial culture, you can now buy gratitude journals where you write daily what you're grateful for. But of course, you don't need to buy a special gratitude journal. You can just use scraps of paper or note paper or do it on your computer. But many people have found that by having a regular practice of writing down what they're grateful for, bringing it to mind, that it changes their lives. And many people have found that by doing this exercise, by writing down in the evening what they're grateful for in that day, as they go through the day, they notice things for which they're grateful as they're actually happening, and feel the gratitude not just in the evening reflecting on the day, but as it's actually going along. People who do that are not only happier, but they sleep better, they're less depressed, and they're just their lives change for the better. As simple an exercise as that. And I think one reason for this working is that it is indeed a kind of flow that all of us receive so much. First of all, the gift of life itself. None of us caused our own life. We're here because of the whole history of evolution on Earth and our parents and our ancestors. We have huge amount to be grateful for that we had no control over before we were born. And we're part of a flow. And we're also part of a flow of the food and the drink and or the clothing and everything we need comes to us through a flow of people's activities. All of us receive care and love and attention from other people, and that helps sustain us. And by being grateful, it's giving something back, acknowledgement. We continue the flow. The opposite of being grateful is taking things for granted or feeling entitled. And people who feel entitled to everything they get and complain if they don't get it are generally speaking much more unhappy than people who are grateful. They're also less popular. So, I mean, it's obvious really, isn't it? But now this is one of the cases where science is proving the obvious. But it brings to people's attention something they may not have thought much about before. In my book, at the end of each chapter, I suggest 2 simple practices that anyone can do to try out these principles for themselves. And with gratitude, one of the most traditional practices, and one of the simplest, is giving thanks before meals. 100 years ago, most people in Europe would have said thanks before sitting down and eating together. As they sat down, they would have said a grace, given thanks, as a family or as a group of friends. And this still happens in traditional institutions. For example, in my college in Cambridge, Clare College, every evening at the beginning of dinner at 7:30 in the evening, everyone's in the dining hall, a gong goes, everyone stands up, and the senior person present reads a long Latin grace. Most people probably don't know what it means, but it does provide a kind of gap, a pause, in which people can give thanks in their own way. But in many families in the modern secular world, where a lot of people have rejected the religion of their ancestors, they usually reject all the practices that go with it, including giving thanks before meals. So in many families now, at least in England, people don't do this. But it's very easy to reinstate it. And in my own family, when it's just members of the family, we all hold hands together silently to create a pause before we eat, when we can give thanks. When there's more people, one of us says a grace, and when we have a bigger gathering, we sing a grace. We have several graces we sing together, and we sing them as rounds so that it's in harmony. And after singing a grace together, the whole room is completely different. The atmosphere is different. Everyone looks happy. They're smiling. It's a wonderful thing to do. It costs nothing. Takes only a minute or less. In England at the moment, in most families, because they don't say grace, there's a kind of awkward pause, an embarrassed silence before eating. And usually somebody says something like, "Oh, do start, it'll get cold." So instead of Thanksgiving, we have a kind of apologetic banality. And it's so easy to turn that around. Now, the second kind of practice I want to talk about is meditation. And this is probably the spiritual practice that's been most investigated scientifically. All religious traditions have meditation. They don't always call it meditation. Sometimes in the Christian tradition it's called contemplative prayer. It's something that's gone on in the Christian world since at least the 4th century, when monasticism began. People in monasteries and convents often spend many hours a day in contemplative prayer, which is a kind of meditation. And the kinds we know about most today are the Hindu and the Buddhist kinds, but it also happens among Jains and among Sikhs and among Sufis within Islam and in other religions. There are 2 main kinds of meditation. There's the kind that involves a word or a phrase or a mantra repeated silently. And that would include the use of prayer beads or rosaries, this repetitive use of phrases or words or mantras. The other kind is called mindfulness meditation and involves just observing the breath or sensations in the body. And both those kinds are very widespread in the modern world. Let me just ask, how many people here meditate or have meditated? Well, that's amazing. That must be, certainly, I can't see very well, but it must be at least 80 or 90%. I myself first started meditating about 1971 when I started with Transcendental Meditation. I was an atheist at the time, and it appealed to me because when they taught it, they said, you don't have to believe anything, just do it and see how you feel. And that was very sound advice. Spiritual practices are about experience. And I think in these areas, experience comes first before theory or doctrine. And for me, I did it, and it changed my way of being completely. I did give it up for years when I had young children. It proved difficult to meditate in the morning when getting young children ready to go to school. But when they finished school, I took it up again, and so it's part of my own daily practice. Well, the scientific studies of meditation began in the 1970s, both at Harvard and in Massachusetts. Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School started looking at mantra-based meditation, and John Kabat-Zinn, another medical man, looked at mindfulness meditation. And both of these types of meditation are now extremely widespread. What Herbert Benson did to start with was look at the physiological effects of meditation. And he soon found a repetitive and readily observable pattern. To understand it, you have to know a little about the autonomic nervous system, which, as you all know, has two sides, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. They're like two sides of the coin. The sympathetic nervous system, of course, has nothing to do with sympathy. It's basically about fear. The sympathetic nervous system is what happens when adrenaline is released into your blood and your heart beats faster, your blood pressure goes up. It prepares you to fight or to run away. It's often called in English the fight or flight reaction. And this is very necessary if you're being attacked or threatened by a predator or a robber or something like that. But in the modern world, a lot of people, even when they're not being exposed to any danger, create an internal danger through anxiety and worry. They're always imagining bad things that could happen and worrying. And this creates a chronic state of activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which leads to ill health. It's really bad to be stressed out unnecessarily. The parasympathetic nervous system is about not being afraid. And you need to be in a parasympathetically activated state in order to do things that require a lack of fear. Making love, for example, eating a meal, even going to the lavatory. You can't do any of these things if you're in a state of fight or flight. If you're being chased by a bull across a field, for example, the last thing you think of is making love or sitting down to dinner. A much more urgent priority takes over. But what Herbert Benson found was that when people are meditating, what he called the relaxation response occurs. Basically, it plays down the sympathetic nervous system, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and people enter a much more relaxed state with lower blood pressure, lower blood rate, lower heartbeat. And this relaxation response, for many people, is a tremendous relief from the anxiety that afflicts their life. The comedian Ruby Wax wrote a book called Frazzled about how to meditate to relieve the stresses of modern life, and that's why many people do it. And people who meditate are measurably, they sleep better on average, and they're less depressed than people who don't. In fact, in Britain, you can now get a prescription for meditation from a psychiatrist on the National Health Service, because it's been found in clinical trials that people who meditate to try and treat mild or moderate depression do better than people who take antidepressant drugs. And of course, they don't have the side effects that the antidepressant drugs cause. And from the point of view of the National Health Service, this is good because it's also cheaper. So this is now being actually officially advocated within our health system, which on the whole is rather conservative and skeptical. People have now done brain scans to study what happens in the brains of people who are meditating. And as you probably have heard, there's a set of areas in the brain called the default mode network, which, when you're not doing anything in particular, this is the network of activity that usually gets going. And it's concerned with ruminations, worries, anxieties, thoughts about things you should have done or might have forgotten to do. It's that kind of internal dialogue, that internal mental chatter that we all have, at least some of the time. And not surprisingly, there are regions of the brain connected with this called the default mode network. During meditation, the activity of the default mode network decreases, and other regions of the brain become more active. That's one of the findings. Not surprising, really, because many people find that the chatter in their mind decreases in meditation. The whole point of the mantra or the mindfulness is to provide another focus for your attention so that you're not fully absorbed in all these thoughts that go through your mind all the time. In long-term meditators like Tibetan monks, there are even quite striking anatomical changes in brains. So meditation has measurable effects both on physiology and on brain function and on brain structure. And again, this is not very surprising. If you lift weights, then muscles get bigger in your arms, and if you do particular kinds of mental activity, then nervous connections get stronger in the regions involved. People used to think that brains had no plastic ability to change, but it's now become clear they do, and meditation can actually affect the wiring in your brain. Well, although meditation is now practiced mainly by most people in a secular context for wellness, to feel calmer, to lead a more fulfilling life, to reduce stress, and so forth, that's not why it was originally carried out by Hindus or Buddhists or Christians or Sikhs or Sufis. They were doing it for quite different reasons. And they were doing it because they thought that it gave them a direct contact with the very source of consciousness itself. I think the Hindus explain this most clearly. In the Hindu view, the ultimate being, the ultimate ground of the whole universe, of everything in nature, and of all consciousness within nature, is the ultimate consciousness, which they have a variety of names for, but Brahman is one of the commonest ones. And Brahman has three aspects, this ultimate consciousness: Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is being, the ground of being, of conscious being, the container, the conscious container of the mind, as it were. Chit is what the mind is conscious of, names and forms and knowledge, the contents of consciousness. And Ananda is joy or bliss. It's also the moving principle of the mind, that which causes change. And the idea is the ultimate mind of the universe, the mind of God, is blissful, is intrinsically joyful or blissful. So whenever our minds come into contact with the divine mind, we experience bliss. And that's why most mystical states involve this sense of joy or bliss, or being part of something great, much greater than ourselves. Well, the Hindus think that all our minds and all the minds of every other conscious being in the universe are reflections of this ultimate mind. They're like fractal versions of it. One metaphor they often use is it's like buckets of water. Imagine hundreds and hundreds of buckets of water, and the moon is shining. And you see the reflection of the moon in each bucket of water. It looks like thousands of different moons, but actually they're all reflections of the one moon, which is reflected separately in each bucket. And in the same way, all our minds are reflections of the ultimate mind, but they each have a sort of scaled down version of it. Normally, within our minds, we're absorbed in the thoughts, the chit aspect of the mind. But through meditation, we stand back and we can see the thoughts going through our minds like clouds through the sky. And then we realize our mind is more like the sky than like the clouds that are going through it. It's that through which the thoughts can pass. And as we come more to the ground of our being, to the very ground of our consciousness, we connect more with that ultimate basis of consciousness, Sat, the conscious being, which is at the heart of the divine mind. According to the traditional Hindu understanding, God is not a thing out there. God is the very basis of consciousness itself. In the Kena Upanishad, one of the holy books of the Indians, it says, it said, not that which is seen by the eye, but that whereby the eye can see. Know that alone to be Brahman, the Lord. And not that which is known by the mind, but that by which the mind can know. Know that alone to be Brahman, the Lord. Not that which is heard by the ear, but that by which the ear can hear. Know that to be Brahman, the Lord. It's our capacity to know, it's our capacity to be conscious itself that connects us with the ultimate mind. And therefore, the role of this spiritual practice is through consciousness itself to go to the root or ground of consciousness. In the Christian understanding of the ultimate mind, it's rather similar. The Christian understanding is that God is ultimately conscious being. The very first announcement of the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition occurs to Moses in the desert, in the burning bush. When he asked God his name, God says, I am that I am. It's a statement of conscious being, subjective conscious being, the ultimate subjective conscious being. And in the Christian model, like the Hindu one, there's a threefold division of God's nature, or three aspects to God's nature. The second person of the Holy Trinity is the Logos, the mind, the form, names and forms, rather like the realm of Platonic forms, the formative principle in all nature. And the third principle, the Holy Spirit, is joy, bliss, and the dynamical principle of the divine. So different traditions have their different models, but they all agree that the ultimate basis of reality is consciousness itself, and that consciousness underlies all nature and underlies all consciousness within it. It's not something out there and separate from nature or separate from us. Well, for materialists who meditate, then there's a problem. How do they interpret what they're doing? Materialists believe that the whole world is unconscious, that all matter lacks any consciousness or mind, it lacks any purpose or meaning. The whole universe is unconscious, all made of unconscious matter. But for some unknown reason, that matter becomes conscious inside brains, especially our brains. That's why the very existence of human consciousness is called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind in the materialist context. Now, for a materialist who meditates, they have the same experiences as often a sense of unity or connection with something greater than themselves. But they believe that it's all happening inside the brain. It's nothing more than what's going on in the brain, a release of dopamine, neurotransmitter, linking up of circuits of electrical activity. It's inside the head and nothing more. Well, that's only a theory about consciousness. And each of us has a choice. Do we put more faith in the theory, which is notoriously bad at explaining consciousness itself, or do we put more of our faith in our own direct experience? All religions are based on direct experience rather than theory. And it may be that we change. When I first started meditating in the early 70s, I was an atheist and I thought it was all inside my head. But partly because of my own experiences through meditation and other spiritual experiences, I came to the conclusion it's more reasonable to think that this is what it seems to be, namely a way of connecting with a greater form of consciousness than our own. But as I say, that's a decision everyone has to make for themselves, and meditation may actually help move the understanding towards putting more weight on experience and less weight on a theory. Which, for other reasons, I think is a very questionable theory. Last time I spoke here in this building on my book, The Science Delusion, I was talking about the limitations of the materialist theory of nature. I'm not going to go into that this evening, but it becomes a personal matter for all of us when we're trying to interpret mystical or spiritual experiences that we may have. The next topic I want to touch on is rituals. All cultures have rituals, and there are several kinds of ritual, but the one I want to discuss first are rites of passage. Rites of passage are ceremonies which take somebody from one social role to another. The most fundamental are dying and being born. When you're born, then you take on a social role, you become a person. And when you die, you stop being a living person and you enter some other realm and also some other social realm where you're an ancestor or you've passed on. There are also rites of passage about changes in our social role, like marriage, where you stop being a single person and become one of the founders of a new family. And there are also rites of passage in adolescence for people to become mature men and women, rites of passage of growing up. The symbolism of many rites of passage is of death and rebirth. You die to your old role, you're born in a new way. And some of them actually involve life-threatening experiences, like the North American Vision Quest, where Native American boys went out into the wilderness fasting for days alone in great danger. Some died. But they faced death, and then they came back with a sense of their new role as a man in that society, and they were integrated by being welcomed back in their new role. Well, I think that some of these traditional rites of passage do actually involve death and rebirth experiences. And we know more about death and rebirth experiences today than any time in the past, because so many people have had them. Near-death experiences are commoner today than they've ever been before, thanks to the advances of modern medicine. Many people who, 2 or 3 generations ago, would have died of a heart attack or a medical emergency now survive, thanks to coronary resuscitation and modern medical techniques. And many people who survive, having been on the very edge of death, in fact, having died and come back to life again, say that they've had experiences which are now called near-death experiences of a very remarkable kind. Very often, people who've had these experiences say they experience themselves floating out of their body, looking down on their body from above, seeing nurses and doctors doing things to their body. They often then find themselves going through a tube, a tunnel, and emerging into a realm of light and joy and bliss, where they feel tremendous love. They're welcomed. They're often welcomed by people they know who've died. They feel welcome, joyful, peaceful, in a state of extraordinary joy. But it doesn't last long because it's only a near-death experience, so they have to go back into their body. Most people who've had these experiences say that it's changed their life. They often say they've lost the fear of death, and they've become much more spiritual people, more loving and caring. And their family and friends often notice these changes too. So these are transformative experiences that come to people in the modern world, not because of spiritual practices. Often these happen to people who've never done any spiritual practices. They come spontaneously as a result of nearly dying and coming back to life again. Well, I think some rites of passage actually induce near-death experiences, which, as we know from these modern scientific studies of near-death experiences, are life-changing. And the one I think that's of particular interest in the context of our own cultural history is baptism. In the New Testament, we read that John the Baptist was baptizing people in the River Jordan, and people were flocking to the Jordan from all over. It was happening on an industrial scale. There were lots and lots of people were coming. And he was baptizing them by immersing them in the River Jordan and then bringing them up. And their lives were changed. The only subjective account we have is of Jesus himself, who was initiated by John the Baptist in this rite of passage. And it was the first moment when he felt this complete connection with God, when he felt this unity with God and his direct, deep relationship. It was immediately followed, in his case, by a 40-day vision quest in the wilderness, fasting, after which he came back knowing his role and starting his public ministry and healing work. Well, normally people interpret the activity of John the Baptist as symbolic of death and rebirth by drowning. But why settle for something symbolic when you can have the real thing? It only takes about 2 minutes longer. In other words, I'm suggesting John the Baptist was a drowner. I think he held them under just long enough to induce a near-death experience by drowning. And I imagine there was a team of helpers resuscitating people on the bank of the Jordan, and probably a line of people waiting for the next one. Then he'd say, "Next, please." And people would have been prepared for this, I'm sure, and there would have been helpers and counselors. But the whole thing makes complete sense if he was actually inducing life-changing near-death experiences. Now, of course, it would require fine judgment on his part to get it just right. And when he started out, he might have lost a few. But that was long before the days of liability litigation. And so I certainly wouldn't want to be baptized in that way by someone who's just starting. You know, you'd want to go to someone who was really experienced, as he was. I think that this experience, which was certainly transformative for Jesus and probably for many other people, that's why people were going. They were having a life-changing experience at the hands of John the Baptist. But within a few generations, the early church had stopped doing this and went over to baptizing children, babies, with water, when I think it was just symbolic. So this experience was lost, at least for the great majority of Christians. But at the Reformation, there was a ferment of activity and religious radicalism at the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And what happened is that people translated the Bible into European languages, and then people read the Bible, and when they read the Bible, they read about John the Baptist and how this was the form of baptism, which was the original form. And what they said was, this Catholic or Protestant method of just pouring water over babies isn't the real thing at all. What we should do is go back to the original kind of baptism by total immersion. And these people were called Anabaptists. Ana means again in Greek. They believed in baptizing people again when they were mature, at least adolescent or mature, by total immersion in rivers or in lakes. They were the most radical people in the Reformation. They were mainly in England, Germany, Holland, and Switzerland. But they were extraordinarily unpopular with both the Protestants and the Catholic authorities because they went round filled with divine light. What they said was, we've died, we've been born again, and we've seen the light. And they behaved as if they had seen the light. And they thought they'd got this direct connection to God through this rite of passage that they'd undergone. I think they probably did have. I think that's what made them so radical and so convinced of their own role. They were persecuted mercilessly. In some parts of Europe, they were executed if they didn't give up being Anabaptists, and the form of execution in some parts of Europe was to execute them by drowning. So this was considered an appropriate punishment. When the possibility of moving to America began in the 17th century, many of them went to America. Most of the religious radicals in Europe who were persecuted by Protestants and Catholics went there because it was a safe haven. There they founded the American branches of the Mennonite Church, the Amish Church, and the Baptist churches that still exist there in America and are still very influential. And of all Christian groups, it's the Baptists who talk about dying and being born again and seeing the light. And I don't know how many modern ones actually have near-death experiences, but I think that at least some of their ancestors did, and I think that it makes a lot of sense to see what that in this light. It makes sense of what they were saying. Most modern people don't have rites of passage of this kind, and I think there's one reason that so many young people take psychedelic drugs, because psychedelic drugs can give, and often do give, a feeling of dying and being born again. The most powerful and intense of all psychedelics is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the effects of which last only about 10 or 15 minutes, but they produce something very like a near-death experience. People who've taken DMT have experienced going out of their body through a kind of tunnel into a realm of bliss and joy and light and love, and then having to come back. Some people experience this with LSD. In the 1960s, the Czech psychiatrist Stan Grof did a lot of research in Prague and then later in America on the effects of LSD. He studied more than 2,000 people who'd taken fairly high doses of LSD. And he found that many of them had an experience which involved being in a place of great discomfort. They felt they were constricted, confined, trapped, often being compressed. And then they managed to escape from that and went through a kind of tunnel and emerged into the light where it was blissful and joyful. I first took LSD myself in 1970, and I had exactly that kind of experience. I'd never heard of Stan Grof or didn't know about his research. But for me, it was a completely transformative experience, and this sense of bliss and joy coming out of this position of being trapped and utterly miserable and trapped and encased in a small container. Well, Stan Grof interprets this in terms of an archetypal pattern, a Jungian archetype. All of us had the experience of being trapped and compressed. When we were in our mother's wombs, just before we were born, we were in the womb with the womb walls contracting and compressing us. It was a horrible place to be. We wanted to get out. And then, sooner or later, we did get out and through the birth canal, a dark tunnel, emerging into the light. And Stan Grof thinks that both these near-death experiences, which happen, the sort of death-type experiences, and birth experiences are tapping into this same archetype. He thinks it's a kind of collective archetypal memory. So even people who are born by caesarean section may still tap into this collective archetype. It's not just an individual memory. And that these rites of passage are ones which give people a sense of this transition. Now, there are many rituals of commemoration which involve people reenacting some original story of their social group. All societies have myths or stories about their origins, and many of them have rituals which reenact the foundational myths. One example is the Jewish feast of Passover. When the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt, and Moses was trying to lead them out of slavery to freedom, there were a series of 10 plagues or curses that fell upon the Egyptians. The last of them was the killing of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians and the firstborn of their cattle. And Moses told the Jewish people to kill a sheep and to put the blood of the sheep on the household, of the door of their household. They would be passed over and they would survive while this affliction hit everyone else in Egypt. And they did that, and then they ate the lamb with bitter herbs and got ready to leave in the morning. And in the morning the Pharaoh said, go. And they started their journey through the wilderness to the promised land. A foundational story in the history of Jewish people. This is reenacted every year at the Passover festival, where they eat lamb with bitter herbs. and tell the story of the original Passover. By doing that, they become part of the Jewish community and connect with all those who've done it before them, right back to the first time. The same is true of the Christian Holy Communion, where all practicing Christians who take communion reenact the ritual of the Last Supper with Jesus with his disciples through eating and sharing the bread and wine. That was itself a Passover dinner. And by doing so, affirm their identity as Christians, part of the Christian community, linking back right to the first time it happened, all those who've done it in the past. And secular rituals have the same form. In America, they have the Thanksgiving dinner in November, when Americans gather with friends and family to celebrate Thanksgiving, which reenacts the first Thanksgiving dinner in New England of the first settlers from England in the New World in 1619. Their first year when they survived, they gave thanks in this Thanksgiving dinner for surviving in the new land. And every year Americans reenact this ceremony with turkey, an American bird, as the main food. By doing so, they become American in identity and connect with those who've done it before. People who do these ceremonies think they're connecting back through time to those who did them originally. And rituals are highly conservative. They often use conservative languages, archaic languages. For example, the Brahminic rituals of India involve Sanskrit, no longer spoken in normal life. The Coptic Church in Egypt has its liturgy in ancient Egyptian, no longer spoken anywhere except within this liturgy. The Russian Orthodox liturgy is in Old Slavonic, again, not the currently spoken form. And mantras are often in ancient words or phrases. Now why are rituals so conservative? Well, I think a scientific explanation is suggested by my own hypothesis of morphic resonance. I don't have time to explain this hypothesis this evening, I'm afraid, but just very briefly to summarize it, it's the idea there's a kind of memory in nature, that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. Each species draws upon a kind of collective memory. Each individual draws on the collective memory of the species and in turn contributes to it. And this is not just a memory of behavior, it's also a memory of form. So each plant species, each oak tree, for example, draws on a collective memory of oak forms of past oak trees, which help shape its growth. Each spider draws on a collective memory of web spinning by its ancestors. It doesn't have to learn how to spin a web. Its instinct enables it to, as it were, remember through this process of memory, which I call morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is resonance of similar forms or shapes or patterns of activity. The word morphic means form, across time. Now, when we turn to rituals, what we find there is that people are deliberately doing things in a similar way as possible to the way it's been done before, which creates the very conditions for morphic resonance and would set up a resonance with those who've done it before right back to the first time, which is exactly what people taking part in rituals say they're doing. They think they're bringing about a presence of the past, connecting through time with those who've done it before and connecting forward to those who'll do it after them in the future. They're part of a chain, a connection through history. And most spiritual practices, in fact, I would say all, are about connection. They're about making us feel, instead of being isolated individuals, we come into connection with a larger group, with history, with ancestors, with forms of consciousness beyond our own. And rituals connect us both with those who've gone before and with the original source of these rituals, which is a divine inspiration of one kind or another. Finally, I want to talk a bit about the last practice I discuss in my book, Pilgrimage. All our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Agriculture came quite late to Northern Europe, not more than 5,000 years ago. And before that, our ancestors lived by hunting and gathering. as indeed until the very present. A few residual hunter-gatherer tribes still exist on Earth, but probably not for much longer. They all have smartphones now. So their culture is rapidly disappearing. But hunters and gatherers had to move around the landscape. They couldn't just sit there and wait for animals to come to them or fruit to drop into their laps. They had to move. They were nomadic, as the reindeer herders, the Sami, are still. So they had to move around. They were nomadic, and they usually went in an annual cycle. And the places they visited, they told the story of. These became sacred places on the route. The Australian Aborigines call these song lines. They sing the story when they reach these sacred places on their annual cycle of journeying. When agriculture first began, then people created ceremonial centers. Stonehenge in England is an obvious example, where they would gather for festivals, mainly at the solstice, particularly the summer solstice. So people would leave their villages and walk to these ceremonial centers where they'd have ceremonies and rituals, then they'd go back again. So this became a kind of pilgrimage to a sacred place. And all religions have pilgrimage. Muslims go to Mecca on the Hajj. They also go to Jerusalem, to the Dome of the Rock, and to other holy places. Buddhists go to the birthplace of the Buddha and to the place he was enlightened. Sikhs go to the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Hindus go to Mount Kailash in Tibet, the source of the Ganges, the holy city of Varanasi, and many of the temples of India, many pilgrimage places in India. And in medieval Europe, there were many, many places of pilgrimage. Some of them were ancient sacred places that were Christianized, like Croagh Patrick in Ireland, the holy mountain, or Loch Derg, the holy lake, which were almost certainly great pilgrimage places before Christianity. Some of them were sacred caves, like the Sainte-Baume in the south of France, which is the place where St. Mary Magdalene is supposed to have lived. But it's obviously an older sacred place and it's surrounded by a sacred grove. And some of the sacred places were where the relics of saints were kept, who were believed to connect pilgrims with the heavenly realms. And usually these were in cathedrals, which were the great shrines to which pilgrims went. Well, everything changed in Northern Europe with the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants didn't like pilgrimage. They couldn't find anything about Canterbury or Trondheim in the Bible. So they decided that these must be not valid forms of activity, probably rooted in ancient pagan practices. Well, they were right, but they decided they should stamp them out, whereas the Catholics were much more tolerant. And so in England, for example, in 1538, Thomas Cromwell, working on behalf of King Henry VIII, issued an injunction against pilgrimage. Pilgrimage became illegal. You just couldn't go on a pilgrimage. The shrines were destroyed. The shrine of the Black Madonna at Walsingham, the most important female saint in England, was burned in a public bonfire. The monasteries were destroyed, which provided the infrastructure for pilgrims. They were places where the pilgrims slept and got food on their journeys. And similar things happened in other Protestant countries. Pilgrimage was suppressed in Scandinavia and in Lutheran Germany, and in the Protestant parts for Protestants in Switzerland. It was then suppressed in France by the French Revolution and in Russia by the Communist Revolution. So there have been suppressions of pilgrimage at different stages in European history. But I think it's such a basic human urge, so deeply rooted in our nature, that it left a great vacuum in the souls of Protestants. And I think that's one reason why within a few generations of the suppression of pilgrimage, the English had invented tourism. Now, I think tourism is, best understood as a form of secularized pilgrimage. Tourists still go to the great sacred places, the ancient temples of Egypt, the temples of India, the great cathedrals of Europe. But when they get there, they can't kneel down and say a prayer or light a candle and be a pilgrim or make offerings or because they have to pretend to be modern, educated, rational people. And they have to pretend they're primarily there because of an interest in art history. So guides spring up to fill their minds with facts that go in one ear and come out the other. It's in fact a form of frustrated pilgrimage, because they can't seek a blessing in that place or go and ask for a blessing, for healing or for inspiration or for blessing or to give thanks if they're just going as tourists. All they can bring back with them are souvenirs and photographs. They can't bring back a blessing to share with people at home. I worked in India for 7 years, and when I was in charge of a scientific unit in an agricultural institute, I had 100 people working under me. I had to sign their forms when they went on leave. Quite often, they'd come and ask to have several days' leave so they could go on a pilgrimage with their family. And when they came back from the pilgrimage, from Hindu temples usually, they brought with them blessed food, a special kind of food that you can have blessed called prasad, which you take back to share with people, to share in the blessings of the pilgrimage. And I loved the fact that they came back and they came and offered me some of the prasad so I could share in the blessing. It was so much more inclusive than just trying to show you the family snaps, the holiday photos. When I went on pilgrimages in India myself, and when Hindus go to a holy place, they don't walk straight in. They walk round it first. They circumambulate it to make it the center. Hindus walk round clockwise. Muslims walk anti-clockwise around the Kaaba in Mecca. So there are different cultural traditions, but circumambulation is a key thing. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of modern Europe is this extraordinary revival of pilgrimage that's going on. What led the way was the revival of the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. It had almost died out. And in the 1980s, a group of enthusiasts in Spain recreated the infrastructure so there were places for people to sleep. You can't walk for days and days with nowhere to sleep or eat, so you have to have the infrastructure. And when they got that in place, in 1987, 1,000 people walked to Santiago de Compostela. Last year, 300,000 people walked there. And by no means all of them devout Catholics. All sorts of people go on this pilgrimage, including many atheists or agnostics, who find it a meaningful expression, and many people who are spiritual but not religious. And pilgrimage is undergoing an astonishing revival all over Europe. In Northern Europe, it's Norway that leads the way with the St. Olaf pilgrimages to Trondheim, which is a beacon for many people in Northern Europe, not just in Norway, but Sweden and Germany. I keep meeting people from Germany who've been to Norway for this pilgrimage. In Britain, there's an organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust, of which I'm one of the patrons. I helped start it, in fact. It's mainly started by two young men who set themselves the mission of reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimages in England. And we now have about 30 different routes and a website, and we're trying to create the infrastructure for an 18-day walk from Winchester to Canterbury, which was the main pilgrimage destination in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Becket, who was martyred in Canterbury Cathedral. And I myself have been doing pilgrimages in England in the last few years. What was a stimulus for me was the fact I have a 14-year-old godson. He was 14 when I thought of this. And I've stopped giving people presents, stuff for presents, because most people have too much stuff. And so I now try and give experiences. And when my godson was 14, I was interested in this revival of pilgrimage. I said to him, my offer for your 14th birthday is this. We take the train from London, we go to a small village called Chartham, we get off the train, we walk the last 12 kilometres of the old pilgrim route into Canterbury through fields and meadows and through orchards. We go to an ancient healing well, the Black Prince's Well. We go to Canterbury Cathedral, we walk round it first. We go in, we light candles, we say prayers, we go with an intention, things to give thanks for and things to ask for. Then we have a cream tea, Then we go to choral evensong. In our English cathedrals every single day they have a very beautiful evening service sung by very well-trained choirs. It's amazing, every day. So we go to choral evensong and then we go home. And I said, would you like to do that? Without hesitation, he said yes. And we had an extraordinarily wonderful day. It was an extraordinarily happy day and blessed. And so the next year, he wanted to do another one. So we went to Ely Cathedral. The year after that, Lincoln Cathedral. Then last year, we went to Wells Cathedral. This year, to Winchester Cathedral. And on the route to Winchester is an old hill with an ancient labyrinth on the top. So we walked the labyrinth. And on the outskirts of Winchester is a medieval hospital called St. Cross that looks after old men. It's called the House of Noble Poverty. And because it wasn't a monastery, it survived the Reformation. And the ancient medieval statutes say they have to provide beer and bread for pilgrims. So when we went there, I asked the porter, I said, we're pilgrims, we're on our way to Winchester Cathedral, could we have the beer and the bread? And she said, yes. She said, we have a supply. And she went, and it was rather good beer and bread. And so we got, it's called the Pilgrim's Dole. So this is it's a remarkable movement, because what's happening is that a lot of people are going on these pilgrimages, are going on a kind of physical expression of a spiritual quest. And it involves connecting with nature, but also with ancient places. And I think these ancient holy places have a kind of inherent memory by morphic resonance. I don't think the memory is inside the stones, as it were. But I think when we enter those sacred places, we come into resonance with those who've been there before, because it's the same stimuli, the same sight, the same smells, the same play of light, and so on. And if there's chanting or rituals going on there, then that, or even more strongly, connects us with this resonance, with the experience of those who've been there before. Memories in places can, of course, be bad as well as good, and many battlegrounds or places where horrible murders have happened are often regarded as having a bad atmosphere or being even haunted. But places where there's been worship, prayer, meditation, and spiritual experiences often have a very uplifting atmosphere, and I think that morphic resonance can help to explain that. And I think that's part of the appeal of these holy places that are the destinations of pilgrimages. Well, that just gives you a brief overview of some of these practices, but I hope enough to see that this revival of spiritual practice that's happening in the modern world is actually a rather remarkable phenomenon. It's sort of underneath the radar of the kind of secular media for the most part. But it's very widespread. It involves, at least in Britain, a lot of young people on a new kind of spiritual quest. And I think we're entering, in fact, a new phase of human evolution. And that's really what I wanted to say to you here this evening. So thank you.